He took to the skies at a time when the enemy seemed unstoppable. His name was Pavel Kamozin, and he was the one who dared to challenge those considered the pinnacle of aerial mastery. The Germans whispered his name with unease, for his maneuvers broke the familiar rules of combat. In this video, you will discover how a quiet young man from Bryansk turned into a pilot, hunted by the finest aces of Europe. Why his clash with the best pilot of the Third Reich became a moment that shifted the spirit of entire armies. What secrets allowed him to survive battles where others vanished in flames? And why even after the war, Kamozin lived as if he knew truths that others could only guess. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. As a child, he endured losses greater than many face in a lifetime. Pavel Mikhailovich Kamozin was born on the 3rd of July 1917 in Bezhitsa, an industrial town that later became part of Bryansk. His father worked in railway workshops, while his mother managed the household with quiet strength. Russia, in his childhood, was a land of revolution, famine, and rapid change. Where other boys played, Pavel observed the discipline of mechanics in his father's shop, learning that every part of a machine mattered. This lesson would follow him into the cockpit. Teachers saw an ordinary boy, yet he showed unusual skill in spatial reasoning and mechanics. When a local flying club opened, he joined eagerly. Aviation in the 1930s Soviet Union was scarce and difficult, but he cared more for the mystery of flight than for glory. He studied how control surfaces worked, how weather shaped performance, and how to draw the most from an aircraft. The club became his second school. He learned to read skies, sense problems in the engine's tone, and fly aging biplanes with care. These hard-won skills saved him later, when others perished in their first clashes with the Luftwaffe. Raised in years of upheaval, Pavel grew into a man able to transform himself, from diligent student of flight to relentless hunter in the sky. As a youth, he already sensed that ordinary life was not meant for him. By 1941, Pavel Kamozin had achieved the rank of flight instructor and was training new pilots at a flying school far from the German border. His life followed a predictable routine: morning flights with students, afternoon ground school, evening maintenance work on the club's small fleet of aircraft. He was 24 years old, methodical in his habits, and completely unprepared for war. June 22nd changed everything. The initial German assault achieved complete surprise, destroying most of the Soviet Air Force on the ground. Entire fighter regiments were eliminated before their pilots could reach their aircraft. Air bases became graveyards of twisted metal and burning fuel. Pavel's unit, fortunately positioned away from the main axis of attack, survived the first day. But survival brought its own challenges. He studied not for knowledge, but for advantage. Within hours of learning about the invasion, Pavel began analyzing every scrap of intelligence about German aircraft and tactics. He interviewed pilots who had encountered Messerschmitt fighters during the brief Finnish conflict. He studied foreign aviation magazines that had somehow made their way to the Soviet Union. Most importantly, he began to understand that victory would require more than courage. It would require systematic preparation and tactical innovation. What seemed like a career turned into a trap. The peaceful world of flight instruction vanished overnight. Pavel found himself flying combat missions in obsolete Polikarpov fighters against pilots who had been honing their skills in Spain, Poland, and France. On his second day of combat, he was wounded in the foot by cannon fire from a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The injury was minor, but it served as a harsh introduction to the reality of aerial warfare. Every step of his youth drew him closer to war, though he did not yet know it. The methodical approach that had made him an effective instructor now became essential to survival. While other pilots charged headlong into combat, Pavel observed and learned. He noted which German formations were most vulnerable to attack, which tactics worked against different types of enemy aircraft, which mistakes were invariably fatal. Instead of becoming a future scholar, the world received a spy. Pavel's analytical mind made him invaluable to Soviet intelligence officers desperate to understand German capabilities and intentions. He began filing detailed reports on enemy aircraft performance, pilot behavior, and tactical innovations. These reports, circulated among surviving Soviet commanders, helped other units adapt their tactics to changing conditions. Too many questions, and far too few answers. The early months of the war were characterized by confusion and retreat. Entire army groups vanished into German encirclements. Cities fell with shocking speed. The Soviet Air Force, decimated in the opening attacks, struggled to maintain any coherent resistance. Yet gradually, through bitter experience and careful observation, pilots like Pavel began to develop effective countermeasures. He entered a world where mistakes meant death. When Pavel returned to combat flying in the fall of 1942, the Soviet Air Force had been rebuilt from the ground up. New aircraft were arriving from factories relocated beyond the Urals. American Lend-Lease fighters provided modern alternatives to aging Soviet designs. Most importantly, surviving pilots had learned from their early defeats. His career began with failure, but it only hardened him. Pavel's first aerial victory came not through superior piloting, but through patience and careful positioning. Flying a Bell P-39 Airacobra, he waited until a German reconnaissance aircraft became separated from its escort, then attacked from below and behind. The classic hunter's approach that minimized exposure to return fire. The Junkers Ju-88 fell in flames, but Pavel felt no elation. Victory meant survival for another day, nothing more. Learning to obey proved harder than learning to command. The Soviet Air Force operated under strict hierarchical principles that often conflicted with tactical necessity. Formation leaders made decisions based on political considerations rather than military logic. Radio discipline was poor, with pilots chattering constantly and revealing their positions to German interceptors. Pavel learned to follow orders while privately developing his own tactical doctrines. His very first mission proved he could bend the rules. Assigned to provide escort for a ground attack formation, Pavel noticed German fighters positioning themselves for an ambush. Rather than maintain his assigned position in the formation, he maneuvered to intercept the attackers before they could strike. The resulting engagement scattered the German formation and saved several Soviet aircraft, but also earned Pavel a reprimand for breaking formation without authorization. That was the moment when his enemies first learned his name. German pilots began reporting encounters with a particularly aggressive Soviet fighter pilot who seemed to anticipate their tactics and counter their standard maneuvers. Intelligence officers compiled a growing file on the mysterious pilot whose radio call sign was Yastreb, Hawk. They noted his preference for close-range attacks, his ability to extract maximum performance from inferior aircraft, and his apparent immunity to the psychological pressure that broke so many Soviet pilots. His first success made him a prisoner of his own ambition. Each victory brought greater responsibility and more dangerous assignments. Pavel found himself flying against increasingly experienced German formations, often outnumbered and always operating at the limits of his aircraft's performance envelope. The stress was enormous, but it also accelerated his development as both a pilot and a tactician. For the first time, he faced betrayal. In the winter of 1942, Pavel's formation was ambushed by German fighters who seemed to know exactly where and when they would appear. Investigation revealed that German radio intercept services had broken Soviet communication codes and were using this intelligence to position their fighters for maximum effectiveness. The revelation that technical superiority could compensate for tactical skill was sobering, but also educational. From that moment on, there was no way back. Pavel Kamozin had become a professional killer, dedicated to the destruction of German aircraft and the pilots who flew them. But he had also become something more valuable, a tactical innovator whose methods could be taught to other pilots. His superiors began assigning him promising young flyers who needed to learn advanced combat techniques. Pavel discovered that he had a talent for instruction that complemented his abilities as a fighter pilot. For him, war ceased to be a map and became faces. The transformation began in the spring of 1943, when Pavel learned that his childhood friend Sergei Azarov had been killed in aerial combat. The two men had trained together at the flying club in Bryansk, had shared dreams of peaceful careers in civil aviation, had promised to meet again after the war ended. Now Sergei was dead, burned alive in his fighter while attempting to protect his squadron commander from attacking Messerschmitts. Every fallen comrade turned him into an avenger. The pilot responsible for Sergei's death was Colonel Hermann Graf, the Luftwaffe's most celebrated ace. Pavel began studying Graf's tactics with the same methodical approach he had once applied to aircraft maintenance. He read German radio intercepts, analyzed combat reports, interviewed pilots who had encountered Graf's formation. Gradually, a picture emerged of a supremely confident pilot who relied on superior aircraft performance and aggressive tactics to overwhelm his opponents. He no longer fought for his country. He fought for himself. The ideological motivations that sustained other Soviet pilots meant little to Pavel. He cared nothing for political theory or military doctrine. His war had become intensely personal, focused on the elimination of specific enemy pilots who had killed men he considered brothers. This narrow focus made him extraordinarily effective, but also increasingly isolated from his fellow pilots. War took everything from him, except his will. By the end of 1943, Pavel had lost most of his original flying club comrades. Some had died in combat, others had been transferred to different units. A few had been invalided out of service with wounds that ended their flying careers. Pavel found himself commanding pilots young enough to be his students, men who looked to him for guidance he was not always prepared to provide. Each loss pushed him closer to madness. The strain of continuous combat flying, combined with the emotional burden of losing so many friends, began to affect Pavel's judgment. He took increasingly dangerous risks, pursuing German aircraft into heavily defended airspace, engaging superior numbers without adequate support. His superiors worried that their most successful pilot was becoming unstable. He trusted no orders, only his pain. Command decisions seemed increasingly irrelevant to Pavel's private war against the Luftwaffe. When ordered to provide defensive patrols, he maneuvered his formation toward areas where German fighters were most likely to appear. When assigned escort duties, he positioned his aircraft to maximize opportunities for engagement rather than to provide optimal protection for the bombers he was supposed to guard. For him, war became a matter of honor. Pavel's motivation had evolved from patriotic duty to personal vengeance, to something more complex, a code of professional excellence that demanded not just victory, but victory achieved through superior skill and tactical innovation. He began developing new combat techniques specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in German fighter tactics. His personal tragedy turned into his strategy. The death of Sergei Azarov had taught Pavel that conventional Soviet tactics were inadequate against experienced German pilots. Soviet fighters typically attacked in large formations, relying on numerical superiority to overwhelm individual German aircraft. Pavel began experimenting with smaller formations that emphasized coordination and mutual support rather than simple mass. In every enemy, he saw the reflection of his own loss. German pilots were no longer abstract opponents, but individuals whose elimination would honor the memory of fallen comrades. This personalization of combat made Pavel extraordinarily focused, but also created psychological pressures that threatened to destroy him. From that moment on, he fought for the dead, not for the living. Pavel's aircraft became a memorial to lost friends, its fuselage decorated with markings that commemorated specific pilots and specific victories. Each successful mission was dedicated to a fallen comrade. Each German aircraft destroyed was offered as a sacrifice to their memory. This ritualization of combat provided emotional stability, but also revealed the depths of Pavel's psychological transformation. This mission was never meant to be possible. In the summer of 1943, Pavel received orders that seemed designed to eliminate him rather than employ his skills effectively. He was to lead a formation of 4 Bell P-39 Airacobras deep into German-controlled airspace to intercept a high-altitude reconnaissance mission. The target was a modified Junkers Ju-86 operating at altitude exceeding 10,000 meters, well above the service ceiling of Soviet fighters. He knew there would be no second chance. The mission required precise timing and perfect coordination. Pavel's formation would have to climb to maximum altitude while remaining undetected by German radar, intercept the reconnaissance aircraft during its brief vulnerable phase while photographing Soviet positions, then escape before German fighters could respond. Any mistake would result in the destruction of his entire formation. Everyone around him believed he was doomed. Soviet intelligence had identified the target as part of a German program to develop high-altitude reconnaissance capabilities that could operate beyond the reach of Allied fighters. Previous attempts to intercept these aircraft had failed completely, with several Soviet formations lost without inflicting any damage on their targets. Every second could have been his last. Pavel's formation climbed steadily through thin air, engines straining to maintain power at altitude, pilots struggling with oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. At 9,000 meters, they spotted their target, a sleek, high-winged aircraft that seemed to float effortlessly above the battlefield. Pavel signaled his wingmen and began his attack. The operation collapsed before it even began, but he found a way out. As Pavel's formation approached within firing range, German fighters appeared from above and behind, a trap carefully planned to eliminate the troublesome Soviet ace. Pavel realized immediately that the reconnaissance mission had been a deception designed to lure him into an engagement on terms favorable to the Germans. Every movement was calculated down to a breath. Rather than attempt to escape or continue his attack on the original target, Pavel led his formation into a climbing spiral that gradually reversed their tactical position. Using the superior low-altitude performance of the Airacobra, he maneuvered his pilots into an advantageous position above the German formation. This was his first true masterpiece of war. The engagement that followed demonstrated Pavel's evolution from competent pilot to tactical genius. He divided his formation into 2 elements, used cloud cover to mask his movements, and timed his attack to coincide with the German fighter's most vulnerable moment. 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s were destroyed in the initial attack, with the survivors scattered and demoralized. Even his allies doubted he would ever return alive. When Pavel's formation returned to base, ground crews and fellow pilots greeted them as men returned from the dead. The mission had been considered so dangerous that replacement pilots had already been selected to fill the anticipated vacancies. Pavel's success proved that German tactical superiority was not absolute. It could be countered through superior preparation and innovative tactics. He risked everything for a single chance. The high-altitude interception mission established Pavel's reputation as a pilot capable of achieving impossible victories through careful planning and flawless execution. More importantly, it demonstrated the effectiveness of new tactical doctrines that would be adopted throughout the Soviet Air Force. The price of success was greater than he had imagined. Pavel's growing reputation brought unwanted attention from German intelligence services, who began developing specific countermeasures designed to neutralize his effectiveness. He found himself the target of elaborate deception operations and carefully planned ambushes. The hunter had become the hunted. The stakes were far too high to retreat. By 1944, Pavel Kamozin had achieved the status of squadron commander and hero of the Soviet Union. His personal victory count exceeded 30 aircraft destroyed, but statistics could not measure his true contribution to the war effort. He had become a tactical innovator whose methods were being studied and implemented throughout the Red Army Air Force. This mission was written in blood. Pavel's greatest challenge came in the form of a direct order from Army headquarters. Eliminate Colonel Hermann Graf, the German ace whose continued presence on the Eastern Front was demoralizing Soviet pilots and inspiring German resistance. The order was accompanied by detailed intelligence about Graf's recent return to combat operations and his assignment to a fighter unit operating in the Crimean Peninsula. His plan looked like madness, and that is why it worked. Rather than attempt a conventional intercept mission, Pavel devised a strategy that relied on psychological manipulation and tactical deception. He would deliberately position his formation in a vulnerable situation, inviting Graf to attack, then exploit the German pilot's overconfidence to achieve a favorable engagement. He worked in complete darkness, and that saved him. Pavel's preparation for the encounter with Graf was conducted in absolute secrecy. He studied captured German tactical manuals, interviewed pilots who had survived encounters with Graf's formation, and analyzed radio intercepts that revealed German operational patterns. Most importantly, he identified specific weaknesses in Graf's standard attack procedures. Even his enemies later admitted, this was a masterpiece of espionage. German intelligence services had compiled an extensive file on Pavel Kamozin, recognizing him as one of the most dangerous Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front. They noted his preference for unconventional tactics, his ability to extract maximum performance from technically inferior aircraft, and his apparent immunity to the psychological pressure that affected many Soviet pilots. Every step led toward death, yet he kept moving. Pavel's tactical plan required him to expose his aircraft to direct fire from Graf's formation while maneuvering into position for a counterattack. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Any miscalculation would result in his immediate destruction. Yet Pavel proceeded with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire career. He played his role so convincingly that the enemy believed him. When Pavel's formation appeared over the Kerch Peninsula, flying what appeared to be a routine patrol pattern, Graf's reconnaissance aircraft reported encountering the Soviet ace in a tactically disadvantageous position. The German pilot immediately began maneuvering for an attack, apparently unaware that he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. This operation turned his name into legend. The aerial engagement that followed would be studied by military historians for decades afterward. Pavel's victory over Hermann Graf demonstrated that individual skill and tactical innovation could overcome apparent technical and numerical disadvantage. More importantly, it proved that the German Luftwaffe was no longer invincible. He was ready to die as long as the mission was finished. Pavel's willingness to accept personal destruction in order to achieve his objectives reflected the psychological transformation that war had wrought in his character. The cautious flight instructor of 1941 had become a professional warrior capable of making calculations that balanced personal survival against military necessity. This was the moment that defined not just Pavel's career, but the evolution of Soviet air power from a force dependent on numerical superiority to one capable of achieving victory through technical excellence and tactical sophistication. The defeat of Hermann Graf marked a turning point in the air war over Eastern Europe, the moment when German pilots began to fear their Soviet opponents rather than merely respect them. For him, war became a personal religion. When Pavel Kamozin learned that Hermann Graf had returned to the Eastern Front specifically to eliminate him, he felt no fear, only a profound sense of completion. The war that had begun as a struggle for national survival had evolved into a personal contest between two professionals who understood each other better than they understood themselves. Graf had arrived in October 1944 with explicit orders to neutralize the Soviet ace, whose continued existence was undermining German morale. The legendary pilot brought with him a reputation built on over 200 aerial victories, including encounters with the finest Allied pilots on both Eastern and Western fronts. He commanded the 52nd Air Division, the same unit in which he had first achieved fame during the advance on Stalingrad. Pavel studied his opponent with the same methodical approach he applied to all tactical problems. Graf was a supremely confident pilot who relied on superior aircraft performance and aggressive tactics to overwhelm his opponents. He preferred to attack from advantageous positions: high altitude, favorable sun angle, maximum speed differential. Most importantly, Graf assumed that Soviet pilots would respond predictably to his standard attack patterns. The intelligence briefing that reached Pavel contained disturbing information about Graf's recent combat record. The German pilot had adapted his tactics to counter improvements in Soviet aircraft and pilot training. He now operated with smaller formations that emphasized coordination and mutual support rather than individual heroics. His pilots had learned to avoid prolonged engagements that might allow Soviet reinforcements to arrive. When the February morning arrived that would bring the two aces into direct confrontation, Pavel felt a strange sense of calm. He had prepared for this moment through months of analysis and tactical refinement. His aircraft, a Bell P-39 Airacobra, was inferior to Graf's Messerschmitt in most performance categories, but Pavel had learned to exploit its specific advantages. The patrol mission began routinely. Pavel led his formation of 4 fighters over the Kerch Peninsula, maintaining standard altitude and formation spacing. His radio discipline was perfect, his navigation precise, his tactical awareness complete. To German observers, the formation appeared vulnerable, exactly as Pavel intended. Graf's formation appeared as expected: 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s at 7,000 meters altitude, positioning themselves for a diving attack on the apparently oblivious Soviet fighters. Pavel's ground controller confirmed the German presence and wished him luck, then maintained radio silence to avoid revealing Soviet awareness of the developing engagement. The psychological battle began before the physical one. Graf circled at altitude, apparently studying the Soviet formation and selecting the most favorable attack position. Pavel continued his patrol pattern, making subtle course corrections that gradually improved his tactical situation while maintaining the appearance of routine operations. Pavel knew that Graf expected him to react conventionally, either by attempting to climb toward the German formation or by diving toward ground level to escape. Instead, Pavel chose a third option that violated all standard tactical doctrine. He deliberately positioned his aircraft to accept Graf's attack, gambling that his superior reflexes and aircraft knowledge would allow him to survive the initial engagement and counterattack effectively. The moment of decision came when Graf committed to his attack. The German ace dove toward Pavel's formation with textbook precision, airspeed building rapidly, gun sight tracking smoothly onto his target. Everything proceeded exactly as Graf's combat experience had taught him to expect, until Pavel's aircraft suddenly disappeared from his gun sight. Pavel's evasive maneuver was perfectly timed and precisely executed. He had studied Graf's attack patterns exhaustively, identifying the exact moment when the German pilot would be most committed and least able to adjust his tactics. The barrel roll and climbing turn that Pavel executed placed him in a position to counterattack while Graf was still recovering from his diving pass. The engagement that followed lasted less than 30 seconds. Pavel's initial burst of gunfire struck Graf's Messerschmitt in the engine compartment, severing fuel lines and igniting vapors that immediately engulfed the forward fuselage in flames. Graf had no choice but to abandon his aircraft, executing the emergency bailout procedures that had saved his life on previous occasions. Pavel watched his opponent's parachute deploy, noting with professional satisfaction that Graf had waited until the last possible moment before jumping, a sign of the veteran pilot's continued tactical awareness, even in defeat. The victory was complete, but Pavel felt no elation. He had simply executed a carefully planned operation with the precision that professional competence demanded. The aftermath of the engagement revealed the true significance of Pavel's victory. Graf's defeat represented more than the elimination of a dangerous opponent. It symbolized the transformation of Soviet air power from a defensive force struggling for survival into an aggressive instrument capable of defeating the Luftwaffe's finest pilots on equal terms. German reaction to Graf's defeat was immediate and revealing. Luftwaffe commanders began issuing new tactical directives that emphasized caution and mutual support rather than individual aggression. The psychological impact of Graf's loss extended far beyond its immediate tactical significance, contributing to the growing demoralization of German fighter pilots who could no longer assume technical and tactical superiority over their Soviet opponents. Pavel's personal reaction to his greatest victory was characteristically understated. When debriefed by intelligence officers eager to extract every tactical detail from the engagement, he provided precise technical descriptions of aircraft performance and pilot behavior. He showed no interest in the propaganda value of his achievement, focusing instead on lessons that could be applied to future operations. The confrontation between Pavel Kamozin and Hermann Graf represented the culmination of 3 years of tactical evolution in the air war over Eastern Europe. What had begun as a hopeless struggle by outnumbered Soviet pilots flying obsolete aircraft had evolved into a sophisticated contest between professional warriors operating at the highest levels of tactical competence. Death became not his enemy, but his ally. After his victory over Hermann Graf, Pavel Kamozin found himself in an unexpected position. He had become a symbol rather than simply a pilot. Soviet propaganda services seized upon his achievement as proof of the superiority of socialist training methods over fascist militarism. Pavel reluctantly participated in publicity events and recruiting drives, but his heart remained focused on operational flying. The final months of the war brought new challenges that tested even Pavel's exceptional skills. German fighters, now operating from bases within the Reich itself, fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Luftwaffe pilots who had survived years of combat possessed hard-won expertise that made them extremely dangerous opponents, even when flying technically inferior aircraft. Pavel's last great aerial victory came in April 1945, during the final Soviet advance toward Berlin. Flying escort for a formation of ground attack aircraft, he encountered a mixed formation of German fighters that included several jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262s. The jet's speed advantage made them nearly impossible to intercept using conventional tactics. But Pavel devised an innovative approach that exploited their limited endurance and restricted maneuverability. The engagement demonstrated Pavel's continued ability to adapt his tactics to changing technological conditions. Rather than attempt direct pursuit of the fast-moving jets, he positioned his formation to intercept them during their most vulnerable phase. The landing approach, when their speed advantage was negated, and their pilots were focused on aircraft control rather than combat awareness. Pavel's final combat mission took place just days before the German surrender. Flying reconnaissance over the rubble of Berlin, he observed the complete collapse of organized German resistance. The Reich that had once threatened to dominate Europe lay in ruins, its air force reduced to scattered remnants operating from improvised airstrips with inadequate fuel and maintenance support. The transition from war to peace proved more difficult than Pavel had anticipated. His skills as a combat pilot had little application in the post-war world, and his intense focus on tactical excellence seemed almost pathological in peaceful circumstances. Like many combat veterans, he struggled to find meaning and purpose in civilian life. Pavel's post-war career reflected the broader challenges facing the Soviet Union as it attempted to transform itself from a wartime to a peacetime society. He remained in the Air Force, serving in various training and administrative positions, but never again experienced the intense satisfaction that came from operational flying against skilled opponents. The psychological legacy of his combat experiences followed Pavel throughout his later life. He had witnessed the transformation of warfare itself, participating in the evolution from individual combat between skilled pilots to technological contests between complex weapon systems. The personal element that had made his victory over Graf meaningful was disappearing from modern aerial warfare. Pavel Kamozin died in 1983, having survived 38 years beyond the end of World War II. His funeral was attended by surviving members of his wartime formation and by young pilots who knew him only through official histories and combat reports. The man who had once been feared by the Luftwaffe's finest pilots passed away quietly, his extraordinary achievements known only to military historians and aviation enthusiasts. His personal effects, discovered after his death, included detailed notebooks containing tactical analyses and combat observations that he had continued updating throughout the post-war period. These documents revealed the extent to which Pavel had remained intellectually engaged with the art of aerial combat, even as technological advancement made his hard-won expertise increasingly obsolete. The legacy of Pavel Kamozin extends far beyond his individual achievements as a combat pilot. His victory over Hermann Graf symbolized the broader transformation of the Soviet Air Force from a defensive organization struggling for survival into an aggressive instrument capable of achieving air superiority over the most advanced air force in the world. Pavel's tactical innovations influenced Soviet air doctrine for decades after the end of World War II. His emphasis on thorough preparation, technical excellence, and psychological analysis became standard elements of Soviet pilot training. The methods he developed for countering technically superior opponents were studied and refined throughout the Cold War period. The confrontation between Pavel and Graf represented a turning point, not just in individual careers, but in the broader strategic balance of World War II. Graf's defeat marked the end of German psychological dominance in aerial combat, contributing to the demoralization of Luftwaffe pilots who could no longer assume victory over their Soviet opponents. Modern military historians recognize Pavel Kamozin as one of the most significant fighter pilots of World War II, not because of his victory count, but because of his contribution to tactical development and pilot training. His analytical approach to combat flying influenced generations of Soviet and Russian pilots, establishing doctrinal principles that remained relevant well into the jet age. The personal dimension of Pavel's story, his transformation from peaceful flight instructor to professional warrior, reflects the broader human cost of total war. His psychological evolution from idealistic young pilot to hardened combat veteran illustrates the profound changes that warfare imposed on an entire generation of participants. Pavel's methodical approach to combat flying contrasted sharply with the more romantic traditions of aerial warfare that had emerged during World War I. He represented a new breed of pilot, technically sophisticated, tactically innovative, and psychologically resilient, that would dominate military aviation throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The memory of Pavel Kamozin has been preserved not through monuments or public ceremonies, but through the continued study of his tactical methods and combat achievements. Military aviation schools throughout the former Soviet Union continue to analyze his victory over Hermann Graf as an example of how superior preparation and tactical innovation can overcome apparent disadvantage. His story serves as a reminder that individual excellence can influence the outcome of massive historical events. Pavel's personal war against the Luftwaffe contributed to the broader Allied victory, demonstrating how the accumulation of individual achievements can produce strategic consequences far greater than their immediate tactical significance. The transformation of Pavel Kamozin from flight instructor to ace pilot to tactical innovator reflects the broader evolution of military aviation during World War II. His career spanned the transition from the relatively simple aerial combat of the early war period to the complex technological contests that would characterize post-war military aviation. Today, in an era of unmanned aircraft and precision-guided weapons, Pavel Kamozin's emphasis on pilot skill and tactical innovation may seem antiquated. Yet his fundamental insights about the importance of preparation, the value of technical knowledge, and the psychological dimensions of combat remain relevant to military professionals operating in any technological environment. The duel between Pavel Kamozin and Hermann Graf stands as one of the classic encounters in aviation history, a meeting between two professionals at the peak of their abilities, fighting under conditions that tested every aspect of their training and experience. Their confrontation in the skies above the Kerch Peninsula represents the ultimate expression of individual skill in aerial combat, a reminder of the human element that remains central to warfare despite all technological advancement. Truth and legend became inseparable when pilots gathered around mess hall tables to share stories of the war. Pavel Kamozin's name appeared in dozens of unofficial accounts that spread through Soviet air bases like wildfire, each telling adding new details and embellishments that transformed documented events into something approaching mythology. One persistent story involved a mission that never appeared in official records, a solo flight deep into German territory to photograph a secret aircraft development facility near Munich. According to this account, Pavel flew a captured Messerschmitt for over 600 kilometers, landed at a German airfield for refueling by claiming mechanical difficulties, then completed his reconnaissance mission before returning safely to Soviet lines. The story was impossible to verify, but its technical details were so precise that many pilots believed it completely. German pilots developed their own collection of Kamozin legends, often more fantastical than Soviet versions. Luftwaffe squadron briefings regularly included warnings about the ghost of Kirch, who allegedly possessed supernatural abilities to appear and disappear at will. Some German pilots claimed that Kamozin flew with modified engines that produced no exhaust signature, making his aircraft invisible to standard detection methods. The psychological warfare aspect of Pavel's reputation became as valuable as his actual combat effectiveness. Soviet intelligence officers discovered that simply mentioning his presence in a particular sector was enough to disrupt German flight operations. Luftwaffe pilots began requesting transfers to other fronts rather than risk encountering the legendary Soviet ace, and several documented cases exist of German formations abandoning missions when ground controllers reported possible Kamozin sightings. Perhaps the most intriguing legend concerned Pavel's alleged ability to predict German tactical innovations before they appeared in combat. Pilots claimed that he possessed captured German training manuals and technical documents that allowed him to anticipate enemy developments by months or even years. While no evidence supports these claims, Pavel's consistent success against new German aircraft and tactics suggests that he possessed intelligence sources unavailable to other Soviet pilots. The most persistent mystery surrounding Pavel involves his apparent immunity to the combat fatigue that affected virtually all fighter pilots during extended operations. While contemporaries like Hartmann and Barkhorn showed clear signs of psychological stress, Pavel maintained consistent performance levels throughout the war. Some medical officers theorized that his analytical approach to combat flying provided protection against the emotional trauma that destroyed less methodical pilots. These legends served important psychological functions for both Soviet and German aircrews. For Soviet pilots, Pavel represented proof that technical inferiority could be overcome through superior skill and determination. For Germans, he embodied their growing fears about Soviet tactical sophistication and individual competence. The myth of Kamozin became more important than the man himself, influencing pilot behavior and tactical decisions throughout the final years of the war. Pavel Kamozin's tactical innovations survived the transition from propeller-driven fighters to jet aircraft, influencing Soviet pilot training programs for decades after his death. His emphasis on systematic analysis and methodical preparation became foundational elements of Soviet air doctrine, shaping the development of fighter tactics throughout the Cold War period. The Gagarin Air Force Academy adopted Pavel's training methods as standard curriculum for advanced fighter pilots. His approach to studying enemy capabilities, analyzing captured equipment, interviewing defectors, testing countermeasures under controlled conditions, became the template for Soviet tactical development programs. Students learned to approach combat flying as an intellectual discipline rather than simply a test of courage and reflexes. During the Korean War, Soviet pilots flying MiG-15 fighters employed tactical principles derived directly from Pavel's World War II innovations. His techniques for exploiting altitude and speed advantages against technically superior opponents proved remarkably applicable to jet combat, helping Soviet-trained pilots achieve favorable exchange rates against American F-86 Sabres. The psychological dimensions of Pavel's approach influenced Soviet pilot selection and training programs throughout the 1950s and 60s. Military psychologists studied his methods for maintaining emotional stability under extreme stress, developing screening procedures designed to identify candidates with similar analytical temperaments. The ideal Soviet fighter pilot became a methodical professional rather than an aggressive individualist. Modern Russian Air Force academies continue teaching case studies based on Pavel's tactical innovations. The engagement with Hermann Graf is analyzed as an example of how thorough preparation and precise execution can overcome apparent disadvantage. Contemporary fighter pilots study his methods for exploiting brief tactical opportunities and managing complex multi-aircraft engagements. Pavel's influence extended beyond Soviet borders through intelligence exchanges and defector interviews. Western air forces obtained detailed information about his training methods and tactical doctrines, adapting elements that proved universally applicable. His emphasis on technical knowledge and systematic preparation influenced pilot training programs throughout NATO countries. The development of advanced fighter aircraft during the Cold War incorporated lessons learned from Pavel's combat experience. Soviet aircraft designers studied his analyses of World War II fighter performance, using his insights to guide development of aircraft like the MiG-21 and Su-27. His understanding of how pilot capabilities could compensate for technical limitations influenced design decisions that emphasized pilot aircraft integration over raw performance. Contemporary military historians recognize Pavel's contributions to the evolution of air combat doctrine. His methods for analyzing enemy capabilities, developing countermeasures, and training pilots to exploit technical advantages established patterns that remain relevant in modern aerospace operations. The fundamental principles he developed during World War II continue influencing how military organizations approach the challenge of aerial warfare. The transition from war to peace proved more challenging than Pavel had anticipated. His exceptional skills as a combat pilot had limited application in a world where aerial warfare had become increasingly technological and systematic. The intimate, personal nature of World War II fighter combat was already becoming obsolete as military aviation evolved toward guided missiles and radar-directed interceptors. Pavel's first post-war assignment involved establishing advanced training programs at the Monino Air Force Academy outside Moscow. His responsibility was developing curricula that would prepare Soviet pilots for the jet age while preserving the tactical insights gained during the Great Patriotic War. The work required him to systematize knowledge that he had acquired through intuition and experience, translating personal insights into teachable doctrine. The psychological challenges of peacetime service affected Pavel more severely than his colleagues realized. He struggled with recurring nightmares about aerial combat, often waking in the middle of the night, believing he was still flying combat missions over the Eastern Front. The intense focus and analytical precision that had made him an exceptional fighter pilot became sources of anxiety in civilian environments where such skills were unnecessary. Pavel's marriage in 1947 to Katerina Volkov, a medical officer who had served at frontline hospitals, provided stability during his difficult adjustment to peacetime life. She understood the psychological scars that combat veterans carried, having treated countless soldiers suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Their relationship was based on mutual understanding of war's lasting effects, rather than romantic idealization. His work with young pilots revealed Pavel's continued genius for tactical innovation. He developed training scenarios that simulated combat conditions with unprecedented realism, forcing students to make split-second decisions under extreme psychological pressure. These methods produced a generation of Soviet pilots whose technical competence and tactical sophistication exceeded anything achieved during World War II. Pavel's influence on Soviet aerospace development extended beyond pilot training. Aircraft designers regularly consulted him about human factors engineering, seeking his insights about how pilots interacted with complex weapon systems. His recommendations influenced cockpit layouts, control systems, and display designs for aircraft, including the MiG-19 and early variants of the MiG-21. The development of nuclear weapons fundamentally changed Pavel's understanding of aerial warfare's role in national defense. He recognized that future conflicts would be decided by strategic bombers and intercontinental missiles rather than tactical fighters, making his hard-won expertise in close-range air combat increasingly irrelevant. This realization contributed to periods of depression that affected his later career. Pavel's final active duty assignment involved investigating aviation accidents and developing improved safety procedures. His analytical approach to understanding aircraft failures and pilot errors saved numerous lives, establishing safety protocols that remained in use for decades. This work provided him with a sense of purpose that had been missing since the end of combat operations. His retirement in 1973 was marked by official recognition of his contributions to Soviet aviation development. He received numerous decorations and honorary positions, but privately struggled with the feeling that his most meaningful work had ended with World War II. The technological complexity of modern military aviation had eliminated the personal element that had made his wartime service so satisfying. Pavel Kamozin's story became a cornerstone of Soviet aviation mythology, inspiring countless books, films, and television productions that celebrated the heroic achievements of great patriotic war pilots. His victory over Hermann Graf provided Soviet propagandists with a perfect narrative of socialist technical superiority triumphing over fascist militarism. Though official accounts often emphasized ideological factors over the tactical innovations that actually ensured his success. The 1962 film Wings Over Kerch featured a character clearly based on Pavel, though legal restrictions prevented direct use of his name or specific biographical details. The movie's aerial combat sequences, supervised by veterans of Pavel's wartime unit, achieved unprecedented realism for Soviet cinema. The film's success inspired a generation of young men to pursue military aviation careers. Soviet children's literature embraced Pavel's story as an example of how determination and careful preparation could overcome any obstacle. Simplified versions of his confrontation with Graf appeared in textbooks and youth magazines, always emphasizing the moral dimensions of the conflict rather than its technical complexities. These adaptations contributed to the romanticization of military aviation that characterized Soviet popular culture. The Monino Museum of the Soviet Air Force preserved Pavel's personal aircraft and combat equipment, creating a shrine that attracted thousands of visitors annually. His flight helmet, logbooks, and tactical manuals became sacred relics for aviation enthusiasts who studied every detail of his combat career. The museum's Pavel Kamozin exhibit remained one of its most popular attractions throughout the Soviet period. Memorial plaques and monuments commemorating Pavel appeared throughout the regions where he had served during the war. The city of Bryansk erected a statue depicting him in flight gear, while the Kerch Peninsula features a memorial at the approximate location of his famous duel with Graf. These monuments became pilgrimage sites for aviation enthusiasts and military history buffs. Contemporary Russian military aviation maintains Pavel's memory through official ceremonies and educational programs. The annual Kamozin Trophy competition brings together fighter pilots from throughout the Russian Air Force to compete in tactical flying exercises based on scenarios derived from his World War II missions. Winners receive recognition as inheritors of his tactical legacy. Modern aviation enthusiasts have created detailed reconstructions of Pavel's aircraft and combat missions using computer simulation and virtual reality technology. These projects allow contemporary audiences to experience approximations of the aerial combat conditions that shaped his career. Flight simulator communities worldwide feature scenarios based on his most famous engagements. The enduring fascination with Pavel's story reflects broader cultural interest in individual heroism during mechanized warfare. His ability to achieve personal victory through skill and preparation provides an appealing alternative to narratives that emphasize technology and industrial capacity over human agency. In an era of increasingly automated warfare, Pavel represents the persistent relevance of individual excellence and tactical innovation.